All right. Hopefully, we'll just wait a little bit for people to crawl in. Um, I just came out of Reed Coverdale's show, uh, in which he had Scott and Ryan Dawson and Eric Jackman on, and that was a very good show. Um, but they're still going. I thought they'd end. I don't like doing a live video that overlaps or interferes with other people's broadcasts, but they're going on like 2.5 hours now. So I'm very surprised that they're keep going. Um, so hopefully everyone's doing well tonight. This is a very interesting topic, and it's also very an obscure topic because whereas everybody knows who Osama bin Laden is, um, very few people are generally aware of Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. And in this video, I'd like to talk about Zawahiri's formulative years, something that is not mentioned even in moderately scholarly discussions. And it's very important to know that people are aware of this individual. And by the way, he is the last remaining survivor of the September 11th attacks, or the orchestrators of it, alleged orchestrators of September 11th. He is still alive, and there is still a $25 million reward for his capture or information leading to his capture. Um, where his where he is a mystery, but he is somewhere in between Afghanistan or Pakistan, and there's not many other countries that would have Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, especially with the weight of the U.S. federal government behind him, looking for him, and it's a sizable reward. I think that is the same amount that was for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. I don't know how much Osama bin Laden was for, but I think Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was also $25 million as well. So Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, $25 million for a reward. He actually is still alive, and there was a few questions about whether he was even dead. There's been rumors that he is dead, but no, he's made a couple of videos. But he has lost a lot of weight behind his power. Most of Al Qaeda is decimated. The majority of Al Qaeda is located in the Arabian Peninsula. They don't have the international foundations as they once had during the uh, mid 1990s to the early 2000s period. And the United States basically has decimated Al Qaeda and destroyed the hierarchy. Osama bin Laden is dead. Mohammed Atef, the military commander, and a lot of their subordinates, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, um, are captured or in Guantanamo. Ahmed al Hasnawi, a financier as well. And also other lower subordinates that were alleged to have been Al Qaeda, like Abu Zubaydah, who is currently in Guantanamo, um, held in indefinite detention. And it's a, he was tortured mercilessly by the CIA under the rendition and torture program. And a lot of these people are, they were the power behind the group. And the emir of Al Qaeda, he's now the leader of Al Qaeda, Dr. Ayman al Zawahiri. So I'd like to start off with his formative years in that um, he was born in Cairo, and he was actually a very studious youth. He excelled in school and he loved poetry. And one person in particular that Dr. Ayman al Zawahiri adhered to was Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb is actually an Egyptian scholar, also part of the initial foundation of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, which was created to oppose the British influence in the country when it wanted its independence. And what they wanted to do was bring back Islam to the fold under a secular government led by King Farouk, and later on, and a much more nefarious individual who spread Arab nationalism was Gamal Abdel Nasser. Dr. Ahmed Swahili didn't like sports, much like Sayyid Qutb. When Sayyid Qutb visited the United States and went to the university here to study, he actually saw that the United States was basically primitive in that aspect, where they wasted water on their lawns, or boxing he didn't like, thought it was a brutal and ignorant sport. Um, Zawahiri studied medicine at Cairo University, and he graduated in 1974. Um, Following that, he spent 3 years as a surgeon while he served in the Egyptian army. Now, one thing about these Egyptian radicals I'm going to mention, and the group that Ayman al-Zawahiri was part of, a lot of them were Egyptian army officers, some of them at the highest rank, lieutenants, uh, lieutenant generals. This is something to pay attention to. After which he served as a surgeon in the Egyptian army, he established a clinic near his parents' home in the town of Mahdi, southern Egypt. In 1978, he would earn a master's degree in surgery and also showed a very clear understanding of Islamic theology and Islamic history. Um, he comes from a very affluent background, his family was, even though his town and his surroundings were quite poor. Al-Zawahiri studied very intently the works of Sayyid Qutb and Ala al-Maldawi and Hassan al-Nadawi. These are Egyptian Islamic scholars as well. Um, he, at a very young age, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, and I believe it was at the age of 14, 15, joined the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood is a little bit different than the other Muslim brotherhoods, such as the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, whereas the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood were based on a political and theological background. Syrian Muslim Brotherhood is a strictly political background that later turned into a very radical fundamentalist group, which later reformed. One thing about the Muslim Brotherhood is that they keep reforming, they keep changing with the generations of the times. Something that Ayman al-Zawahiri didn't agree to, and I'll point this out in a little bit. The group that he joined is called the Jamaat al-Ansar al-Surah al-Muhammadiyah, which is translated from the Arabic. It's called the Association of the Followers of Muhammad's Path, which is an Islamic sect from the Muslim Brotherhood. And afterwards, while he was studying at university, he joined a jihadi cell headed by Saeed Tantawi. And Tantawi was a very influential figure in al-Zawahiri's early teenage years, in that Tantawi comes from a Takfiri background. What is a Takfiri background? Takfiris are considered Muslims of the Salafi kind, Salafist or Wahhabi kind. These are offshoots. They're affiliated with the Sunni majority Islamic group, but they're radicalist branches where they believe that the Islamic community outside, just within the Sunni group, they consider Shias and Sufis and Alawites as heretics, non-Islamic. And so they'll consider them apostates or munafiq, which is translated to fake Arab, fake Muslim. Takfiris are people of the book, as they say, that denigrate other Muslims of other backgrounds, like Sufis and Shias, as non-Muslim, as munafiq. Takfiri, those who declare other Muslims as non-Islamic. And these people they consider apostates, Islamic apostates, as even worse than, say, Jews or secularists or Christians. They hate the Sufis and the Shias and the Alawites and the Hanafis, as they don't like these people. They hate them and they consider them worthy of death. Nevertheless, al-Zawahiri studied under Tantawi, and this is where he became part of the Takfiri mentality. He also trained al-Zawahiri to assemble explosives and how to use guns. And in 1974, the group that Tantawi and Zawahiri were with split because the group declared Tantawi's brother as an infidel, a kafir. Um, this is what happens when the Takfiris don't consider other Muslims as strongly believed or strong within the Salafist Wahhabi ideology, and they'll just easily just commit them as Takfiris, worthy of death. In 1975, after the split, it was Tantawi who traveled to Germany. And Ayman al-Zawahiri took over the leadership of this very small cell. And he immediately organized this small cell with other people like Isam al-Kamari, Khalid al-Islambuli, Muhammad ibn al-Faraj. And a lot of these people, and Munir al-Zatayat was a lawyer who wrote a book called Al-Zawahiri As I Knew Him. And it's a very good book, actually, and one of the very few books in the world that could speak with any authority about who Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri really was. So I will name the book again. It's called Al-Zawahiri As I Knew Him. It's an excellent book. I would suggest getting it to understand al-Zawahiri in a much more in-depth book. No other book in the world comes close to understanding Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. And it was during this time that al-Zawahiri decided to create this small group of military commanders in the Egyptian army, as well as theological professors, self-appointed theological professors. A lot of these people from the Takfir background are not scholars at all by any means. One thing about Salafists and Wahhabis is that they are very fundamentalist, ultra-Orthodox, very fervent in their beliefs, but they don't read. They come from a very poor background where literacy is absent in their lives. So they learned from an imam. And the imam, much like an evangelical pastor here in the United States, in these, prosperity gospel churches, they'll, be the imam or the leader, the teacher, to a bunch of people who are basically coming from a very illiterate background. Now, in these neighborhoods in Egypt, it was very easy to get a lot of these people from a very poor background who hated the government anyway, because the government was corrupt and was very deficient toward the middle and lower classes. So there was no shortage of influx in regards to getting any recruits for these radical fundamentalist cells. They're willing to join these groups to try and change and overthrow the governments, and we'll get to that in a minute. Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri basically created a small group and called it Al-Jihad. And what this did was, it was basically creating a small group that would basically fundamentally adhere to the principles of Sayyid Qutb and Ibn Taymiyyah, who's a Hadith scholar. And Ibn Taymiyyah, the foundation of Salafists, this foundation of Wahhabi, come from Ibn Taymiyyah. Another individual who's influential in Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri's life is Muhammad ibn al-Salam, Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab, the founder of Wahhabism. And it's not particularly clear what year this group was made, but it was somewhere in the late 1970s, mid-1970s anyway. The organization's primary goal was to overthrow the Egyptian government, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who is the primary influence of the mid-1950s and 70s Arab nationalism, which basically was a subversion of religious fundamentalism. Nasser saw the dangers of fundamentalism and basically subjugated a lot of these religious fundamentalists. So they went underground. They tried to destroy the Muslim Brotherhood, but by imprisoning them and torturing them, they created a more fervent ideology, which led to al-Jihad. And later on, a lot of these people that I'm going to be talking about were basically tortured as well. And they created a more fundamentalist approach to al-Jihad and basically integrated with Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. And also, the intelligence services are basically involved. I'm going to get to that in a minute because that's also something that's going to be very imperative to learn, because what we always learn about the CIA and we learn about the NSA is really Mossad, but the SSI, which is the Egyptian Security Services, uh, the Egyptian Security Services, which is much more brutal, and which were um, taught by the Russian KGB on how to torture people in the early 1930s and 40s. So what they wanted to do was basically overthrow the Egyptian government and replace it with Islamic State. And later on, the group broadened its aims to include American and Israeli interests in Egypt and abroad. I'm going to get to that because that's actually the most important point regarding Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri and where he got that ideology from. Nevertheless, um, it was after the Six-Day War in 1967, in which Egypt defeated Egypt and Syria, that radicalized not just Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, but also to hundreds of thousands of Arabs of the Wahhabi sect alone. And so they saw the Arab Nationalist Socialist contract as a failed endeavor. And once this happened, Israel basically destroyed, whether they even knew it or not, basically eliminated Arab nationalism. And because of that, the rise of the fundamentalist groups came. Groups like Gamma Islamiyah, which is an Egyptian fundamentalist group, and of course Al Jihad, which later was renamed to Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Also, other Salafi groups came out of this, and I'll name them in a little bit later. But initially, these groups and these people basically saw that we need to combat Israel and at the same time also combat ideologies or other religions like Christianity and Judaism that would be an affront to Islam. Now, of course, let me be quite clear here. A lot of Muslims around the world, the majority of them, I'd say 90% to 95%, abhor these groups and abhor Salafist Islam, Wahhabi Islam. Sunni, even though they're attached to the Sunni branch of Islam, the Sunni majority consider these people heretics, not even Islamic. And they would be right, because these people don't adhere to the Quran, they adhere to the Hadiths. So Ayman al-Zawahiri created this small group, and one thing they wanted to do was basically force the Egyptian government to bend its hand and take over the country, which are going to be led by the Quran and the Sunnah. That's what they believed. And so they created an operation in which they were going to assassinate the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat. Sadat took over the president after Nasser died in 1970. And Nasser basically was seen as a more liberal reformer than Nasser. Basically, one of the first things he ever did was basically release a lot of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Wahhabis out from the prisons. But by that time, a lot of these people were radicalized even further in these prisons. And what they wanted to do was basically agree with Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri and others. There's two branches, one in the north of Egypt, another in the south of Egypt, of the group Al-Jihad. One was led by Muhammad ibn al-Faraj, and another was led by Isam al-Kamari and Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. So what they wanted to do was basically force out Sadat, depose him, and basically take over the media and the airwaves, and then have a lot of these people who are from the Egyptian army anyway, take over the military and then take over the country. That was the goal of what they wanted to do. Sadat was assassinated in 1980, and basically what happened was his vice president, Hosni Mubarak, who was at this procession commemorating the Suez Canal, and it was a military procession. So a truck came over and basically shot at the promenade, which was where Sadat and Hosni Mubarak was, and they assassinated Sadat. He was killed, but Hosni Mubarak was injured. Mubarak takes over, as president, and basically is the worst idea to the fundamentalists. And what he did was basically arrest everybody. One of those people was Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. And they tortured Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri brutally. He was hung upside down. He was electrocuted. They put live cigarettes on his body. Um, they sick dogs on his legs. And yeah, it was pretty bad. But what they wanted was they wanted Isam al-Kamari, who was a military commander in the Egyptian military, was giving weapons. He actually gave the weapons to the people who assassinated Sadat. One of those people was a lieutenant general in the army, Khalid al-Islambuli. And Isam al-Kamari is a military commander, but they didn't know where he was. But they knew that Ayman al-Zawahiri was his best friend. And Ayman al-Zawahiri agreed to set up Isam al-Kamari, and basically he knew Isam al-Kamari was going to this one mosque where he prayed at night and was going to meet with other people in a very secretive meet. But Ayman al-Zawahiri was there and set up Isam al-Kamari. Because of this, because of Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri informing on his best friend Isam al-Kamari, it ruined him and it changed him. And he never forgot that. And Zawahiri, even though he went through torture, he actually testified in the Torah prison and in the courts. And this is relegated in the book by Montasir al-Zayat that I mentioned before, in which Montasir al-Zayat said that Ayman al-Zawahiri testified against Isam al-Kamari and others in a court of law about the assassination of Anwar Sadat. Whether he was forced or not is irrelevant, okay? Because what happened was he basically changed radically from this. And because of this, he decided to take out his anger on anyone involved with the Egyptian government. The Egyptian police went inside the house of Mohammed ibn al-Faraj, leader of the Cairo branch of al-Jihad. And what they found was a document called The Neglected Duty. And in this document, basically outlined two enemies. One was called the near enemy. The near enemy is Arab secular governments that existed under Gamal Abdel Nasser. Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and what they wanted to do in Libya, and what they wanted to do was to take over one country at a time, basically eliminating these presidents and forcing and getting recruitments in the military to then force a deposition of sorts, force the secular governments out of these countries, and then one by one create an Islamic country, whereas they would have a caliphate in the region of the Arabian Peninsula and Africa, north of Africa. And because of this, they would go on to the other enemy. The other enemy is the far enemy. The far enemy is the United States and Israel, in which they considered the United States and Israel the primary cause of the division of the Arab and Islamic republics, in that they saw that the United States, U.S. imperialism, as well as the Israelis' own imperialistic nature toward the Palestinians, was basically a war on Islam. So they considered this not an end to the war, the Crusader war against Islam. They saw it as an extension, and that it never ended. And that's the mentality of these Takfiris, of these Wahhabis, these Salafis, is that they have this warped view of the world. Not saying that they're totally wrong. I mean, U.S. imperialism does exist. The Israelis' nationalist policy, Zionism, does exist, and they are antithetical to Islam. However, these are not the right people to become the spokespeople for the Arabs themselves. The people that we should hear from are from the moderate Islamic voices who abhor violence, who abhor ideologies which are based upon the anti-ethical positions toward their religions. And this is a fine line because even though I'm atheist and I'm still learning about Islam in general and other monotheisms as well, is that I do have a slight understanding, if you will, of Wahhabism and Salafism, and I know for just by studying these ideologies that they're anti-ethical to Islam as a whole. And Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri basically um, became full and enveloped with the Takfiri ideology. And so what happened was Egypt, after the sentencing of these people that were involved with the Sadat assassination, um, basically it was over 1,500 people that were arrested. And a lot of these people were tortured mercilessly, terribly. And they released a lot of these people. And a lot of these people also came from other countries, but a lot of them were Egyptians. So Ayman al-Zawahiri was released, and he went to Pakistan because at that time, Afghanistan, which was invaded by the Soviet Union, called on a declaration of the Islamic Ummah, or the group Islamic Unity, um, to come and engage in jihad, a noteworthy jihad, which is which was a noble cause. There are no winners here. The Soviets are an evil empire. Not to say that what's going on in Ukraine is it's all Russia's fault. No, it's not that easy. There's a lot of history behind Ukraine and the United States and the CIA's, involved in it. And I'm not going to get into that now. But Soviet Union invades Kabul in 1979 under the pretense of deposing a lot of these Russian conscripts who were basically slaughtering Afghan Pashtuns wholesale. And, they saw the Russians as a secular invader. And this brought about a whole bunch of Muslims to the fray. But one thing was for certain: the Afghans, led by an ideology called Hanafi, saw the Arabs, foreign Arabs, as a useless lot because they weren't very good fighters. The Afghans were. They were exceptional fighters in their own right. When the Egyptians released Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri and people like Omar Abdel Rahman of Gamma Islamiyah, Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, a lot of these people served in the Egyptian military. So they went to Pakistan, they went to Afghanistan. And what they did was basically offer their services of commanding armies or commanding groups in the Arabs. And the Arabs made up about approximately 10 to 15% of the fighting force of the conscripts that fought against the Soviets in Afghanistan. But what they did was Ayman al-Zawahiri went to the Red Crescent Hospital in Pakistan. And that is where he met Osama bin Laden initially. He also met with other Afghan warlords like Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, Jalaluddin Haqqani, which later on made the group called the Haqqani Network, an offshoot of the Taliban, which basically are somewhat still around to the very day. They may go under a different name. And a lot of these people have to change names so they won't grab the attention of U.S. intelligence and the military, and what other foreign intelligence services also. So he would spend the next 4 months in Peshawar in Pakistan. And what he did was basically, he was a foreigner. He was not known to many people. They knew about his activities in Egypt and with the Al-Jihad network, but the Afghans didn't like Arabs. They didn't like foreign Arabs. So he was put on like a leash of sorts. At the same time, what was happening in Pakistan was that there were 3 individuals. Osama, an Algerian scholar named Abdullah Anas, as well as a Palestinian imam and scholar in his own right, and jurist, Abdullah Yusuf Azam. Azam went to Saudi Arabia and visited Osama bin Laden before he came to Pakistan, and pitched him an idea that because there was such an overwhelming response of Arabs coming into Pakistan to serve in the fight against the Soviets, they wanted to create an office or a bureau of sorts where they can process these people and teach these people about how to fight in small arms or major arms, combat fire. Uh, Also, to learn about theology, because Azam saw the war as a theological framework. This was disagreed upon by bin Laden and Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, and it was Zawahiri who instituted that to bin Laden. I'm going to get to that in a short minute. And what he did was basically change the foundation of the war. Azam, he was such a brilliant linguist. He was such a brilliant orator, and as well as a very powerful theologian in his own right, and wanted to push this idea of defensive jihad, which basically wanted to use the Islamic world to defeat the Soviets. And what happened was you had a lot of foreign aspects involved with the war, NGOs, non government organizations, most of them from the United States. And Azam saw this as basically an insult, because what he didn't want was this to turn out to be the US's war. This was to be an Islamic war, but for the right reasons. And Azam had the right reasons. So did Abdullah Nas, and so did others as well, other Afghan warlords. But Afghan warlords are very finicky. They will bicker over the smallest things and basically just fight over this, just pure bureaucrats. The Afghan leaders were, and this basically offended Azam. So here he comes to Pakistan, and he brings with him those who were in jail for the Sadat assassination: Abu Ubaid al-Banshiri, Abu Hafs al-Masri, later renamed Muhammad Atta, and a lot of and Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, also known as Dr. Fadl, who would write a very important paper. And basically, this paper would shape Wahhabism to a new cause, it would actually supplant Azam's ideology. And it was called, I want to try to remember the Arabic. I'm gonna butcher it. It's called the Al-Umda, Fada al-Uda, or something like that. But from the Arabic, it's called the Essentials of Making Ready for Jihad, in which, and I'll read you from the transcripts, the guide begins with the premise that jihad is the natural state of Islam, and that Muslims must always be in conflict with non-believers, resorting to peace only in moments of abject weakness. Because jihad, above all, is a religious exercise, there are divine rewards to be gained. He who gives money for jihad will be compensated in heaven, but not as much as the person who acts. The greatest prize goes to the martyr. Every able-bodied believer is obligated to engage in jihad, since most Muslim countries are ruled by infidels who must be forcibly removed in order to bring about an Islamic state. The way to bring an end to the ruler's unbelief is armed rebellion. And I'll end it there. This text, which you probably have never heard of, and I don't blame you, is the primary reason, as well as Ayman al-Zawahiri's and Sayyid Qutb's and Ibn Taymiyyah and Muhammad Ibn al-Wahhab, all these ideologies are basically ingrained in this text. And this text becomes the text for all jihadi networks in the world from that point forward, even Al-Qaeda. Because Al-Qaeda wasn't a terrorist organization initially, it came from an Arab base. And I did a live discussion on that. You could look at that video. Ayman al-Zawahiri and Dr. Fadl and Abu Ubaid al-Banshiri and all these Egyptians basically come to Peshawar. Now they're taking over these Afghan Services Bureau buildings. And there's a number of buildings that were being built with bin Laden's money. That's why Ayman al-Zawahiri and Abdullah Nas went to Saudi Arabia to visit him to pitch the idea, because they didn't have the money. Bin Laden did, through the Saudi bin Laden group, which basically are friends with the Bush administration, the Bush family, through an intermediary called James Bath, who's a Texas millionaire many times over. James Bath, who's friends with the Saudis and the bin Laden family, introduced George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr. to the bin Laden family, in which he would help Bush Jr.'s oil company, Arbusto, to become prominent in Texas. And bin Laden bought a lot of stocks and uh, became a large shareholder in the company, and the company took off. Okay. Now, bin Laden, who basically is straight out of University of King Fahd and studied electrical engineering and integrated himself in the war. He didn't have to. He's a millionaire many times over and is the 51st son of the bin Laden family. Didn't need to enter this war, but he did. And he offered his services, his construction equipment to build road, to build ditches in the war. He was seen as a savior. And his legend grew, especially from building the first Arab camp in Afghanistan called al-Masada. And a lot of these people that went to these camps were the Egyptians, led by Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. And why is this important? Because what the Egyptians did was basically, through Ayman al-Zawahiri's presence, change the foundation of bin Laden's thinking and change the ideology of the al-Masada camp into a more rigorous, more fervent ideology. Same thing for the Afghan Services Bureau, where they saw Azam as more of a nuisance, promoting this jihad network that only constitutes against the fights against the Soviets. No, that wasn't enough. The fight had to go beyond those borders. Whereas Azam wanted to bring the next war against the Israelis for the Palestinians, Zawahiri, as well as another Egyptian radical, Omar Abdul Rahman, who's in the United States at this point, at the Al Farouk Mosque in Brooklyn, they wanted to use the money that were coming in from the Maktab al-Khidmat, which was the name of the Afghan Services Bureau. And billions of dollars were pouring in, not just from the CIA through the Pakistan ISI, but from Saudi donors and from organizations, Islamic relief groups all around the world. Billions went through this. I mean, millions of dollars went through this organization. Now, they had a trickle effect to bin Laden's group and Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, but they didn't accept direct payment from like the CIA, which is, a conspiracy theory involving bin Laden and Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. Oh, they worked for the CIA. No, they didn't actually. Dr. al-Zawahiri would later write a book called Knights Under the Prophet's Banner, where basically in his book he says that this was a West creation, that bin Laden worked for the CIA or took money from the CIA. He didn't need to, and which is right, because he was getting money from his construction company, his father's construction company, the Saudi bin Laden group. Zawahiri, by the end of the war, the Soviets retreat. Zawahiri basically took over the Maktab al-Khidmat office. Bin Laden becomes the sole proprietor. Azam is kicked out. And now the change begins at the al-Masada camp. So they start building up more Arab camps in the south of the country, in Pakistan, and later on in the Sudan. But while this was going on, in 1989, Azam is assassinated. But before that, Dr. al-Zawahiri used to spread rumors about Azam, saying that he was an agent of Israel or an agent of Saudi Arabia or even an agent for the Pakistan ISI. Nothing was too good for Dr. al-Zawahiri. Why did he do this? Basically, what he wanted to do, and this is basically conspiracy theory, but it's reasonable, was that he wanted to take over the Maktab al-Khidmat and use that money, take the members of the al-Masada group, and then create that group called Al-Qaeda, which is the base. What does he mean by base? Is it a database? No, it's the base, which was the al-Masada base. Al-Masada, the lion's den. That's where the base of operations grew, where all these Arabs and the Egyptians trained in small arms fire, in bomb making, and created other camps in Afghanistan later on. That's where this comes from. And this ideology that Dr. al-Zawahiri brings, the textbook, the doctrine of Dr. Fadl, Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, and all these other generals, the members of the military committee of the Egyptian army, all create, along with these radical Arabs from all over the world, would create al-Mossad into al-Qaeda, the ideology of al-Qaeda. And so Ayman al-Zawahiri, instead of using al-Qaeda to defeat the secular Arabs in Egypt, to defeat the government in which he was fighting that war too, wanted to change the nature and focus on the United States and Israel, the far enemy, for which they were not prepared for this. I mean, anyone with a right rational brain knows that al-Qaeda, this ragtag bunch, people that could, could train in small arms fire and bomb making, are no match for a massive monolith of the military of the United States and the coalition partners. So why did Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri change the nature of the fight from the near enemy to the far enemy approach like this? Why did he do it? And that's a question that's unanswered at the current time. Now, at the same time, we have intelligence services like the CIA and the NSA. God knows who else. British MI6, Israeli Mossad, Pakistan ISI, I'm pretty sure, who are integrating in these training camps, in these groups. And it's left up to the imagination as to what information they had throughout the years. Now, why do I imply this? Because in the early 1990s, the CIA, the FBI, basically just hears about Osama bin Laden for the first time, and basically say, well, who is this guy? So they go to the CIA, and the CIA gives them 40 file binders on bin Laden. We're talking about the early 90s here, friends. And they're bringing over like 40 file binders of information relating to bin Laden and al-Qaeda. Well, that's coming from the early years in Afghanistan and Sudan, because they relocated to Sudan in 1992. And that's where al-Qaeda originally begins as a group. And we know that through a number of documents called the Harmony documents, al-Tariq and al-Osama documents. They're in Arabic only, but some are translated from the English, and you have to find them. But they're well worth your understanding, because this is the exegesis of al-Qaeda and what Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri brought to al-Qaeda. He brought the ideology of Dr. Fadl and the ideology of Muhammad ibn al-Faraj, the near enemy, far enemy approach. Now, in his book, The Knights Under the Prophet's Banner, Ayman al-Zawahiri basically says that this was his ideology, the near enemy, far enemy approach. No, it wasn't. It's Muhammad ibn al-Faraj. So what goes on here from this point on? What we do know is basically Zawahiri is a major influence in bin Laden's life. The single most influential male figure in bin Laden's fight outside of his father in his early years. But during his adult years, it was Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. And not to say that bin Laden himself was an aloof individual who basically was a pushover. No, he was not. He was a visionary, but his visionary was shaped through U.S. imperialism and the ideology of Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. So, in other words, what I'm telling you is that there is no real innocent person in all this in regards to terrorism and the effects thereof, because U.S. foreign policy is detrimental to the Arab world during the 1980s and what we could say from the 1970s to the early 2000s, and maybe even the future going forward. But it hasn't been the focal point. Now it's being changed to Eastern Europe, and that's for another discussion. But the Arab world has been subjugated by U.S. imperialism and their foreign policy. Ayman al-Zawahiri was basically just a product of that. But basically, he is himself a spoke in the wheel of sorts in regards to becoming that person. He didn't have to become that person. He could have chose to be a reasonable and moral individual, but he chose not to. But it wasn't like the choice was very hard to make, if you know what I mean. So what I'm saying is that U.S. imperialism basically pushed Zawahiri, pushed bin Laden, pushed other radical Arab fundamentalists in that direction. And it wasn't very hard. All they needed was the motivation to do so. That's all. Um, but Zawahiri didn't forget that Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt, was one of the reasons why he was in Pakistan and why he was this way. So Egyptian Islamic Jihad and the Gamma Islamiyah group, another radical fundamentalist group in Egypt, still tried to commit terrorist actions in Egypt. And one such venture was in 1995 when members of Egyptian Islamic Jihad tried to assassinate Hosni Mubarak, but failed while he was going to a conference meeting in Ethiopia. And Zawahiri was also implicated in an assassination attempt on then Pakistan Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, who was seen as who is a woman, first of all, in an Islamic country, 95% Islamic, based on the principles of Hanafi and Wahhabi, and basically wanted her out of the way. But she was actually assassinated by a group of assailants that weren't affiliated with Ayman al-Zawahiri in the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. The Al-Qaeda group basically integrated with the Egyptian Islamic Jihad in the year 1999. And what happened was in 1998, bin Laden, through the influence of Rafai Taha, part of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, was a co-signer of the document Jihad Against the Crusaders and Jews, which was the second fatwa by bin Laden, in which, in this declaration, bin Laden made no distinction between civilians and military. Whereas the first fatwa in 1996, bin Laden created a fatwa that wanted to just eliminate U.S. military from Mecca and Medina, the two most holiest sites in Islam. And this second fatwa basically helped Ayman al-Zawahiri because he needed bin Laden's money in regards to trying to fight another war, which was the near enemy approach in trying to kill Hosni Mubarak and implement an Islamic caliphate in Egypt. So that was another reason why he joined with bin Laden, and Egyptian Islamic Jihad joined with Al-Qaeda and create the World Islamic Front Union. And from that point forward, they wanted to take the war to the United States. They were behind or affiliated with the bombing of U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya in '98. And of course, an outside agitator who was not affiliated with Al-Qaeda at the time, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was a Baluchistan family, whose nephew is Abdul Basit al-Karim, Karim al-Basit, also known as Ramzi Youssef, who is behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, as well as the Bajinka plot, which is where 9/11 came from. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed went to Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri and Mohammed Ataf and Osama bin Laden and pitched the idea of the planes operation. And initially, it was to hijack 10 planes and crash them into the Sears Tower, the Golden Gate Bridge, CIA headquarters in Langley, World Trade Center, Pentagon, U.S. Capitol, White House, and a nuclear facility. But it would require too much. Now, take this with a grain of salt, that this was pitched to bin Laden, because it came from the torture of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi bin al-Shibh. However, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi bin al-Shibh did an interview with Yosri Fuda of Al Jazeera. And basically, this is before they were even tortured, and told them about what they did. They were behind 9/11. And the book is called Masterminds of Terror, written by Yoshi Fuda and Nick Fielding. And I've interviewed Nick Fielding. It was a fantastic interview. And that story turned out to be true. So they were the orchestrators of 9/11, but it wasn't like they had help. And I'm talking about the intelligence agencies. Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri told bin Laden about the far enemy approach, and what they needed to do was basically fight a war on two fronts: near enemy, far enemy approach. And bin Laden agreed. But bin Laden knew he couldn't defeat the U.S. military. He knew by doing this, the planes operation, that they would invade Afghanistan. But according to bin Laden's own son, Hamza, he underestimated the power of the United States. Because with the 1998 East Africa bombings, the U.S. military did nothing. Clinton administration did not overreact. And this disappointed bin Laden. And so instead of attacking U.S. installations abroad, they would take the fight to the country itself. But they would have to need help, I guess. And they got that help because and this is what I believe, is that the NSA, who was listening to bin Laden's satellite phone up until from 1992 to 1998, and then also a house in Yemen from 1996 to 2001. What do you think they were talking about on those phones? And we're not talking about like people who talk about the Yankees or Kim Kardashian's growing rear ass and stuff like that. These are serious men. And they're talking about operations. Did they talk about the planes operation? Did they talk about the East Africa bombings? They heard Ayman al-Zawahiri's voice on the phones, according to the NSA. They knew who he was. They knew who bin Laden was. Just use your head. What do you think they were talking about? So if they knew about the operation beforehand, they would make the necessary arrangements for the operation to be successful. Like, say, have NORAD exercises somewhere north of the country. And if you believe that the World Trade Center came down by explosive demolitions, that in maybe the months prior or the weeks prior, maybe putting bombs in the basement levels or whatever. I don't talk about these issues because I'm not qualified to. So Zawahiri, at this point, was a major factor in bin Laden's thinking and the way operations are held. Now, a lot of these operations are led by the military committee of Al-Qaeda. Who are the military committee leaders? Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, Mohammed Atef, and Ali Mohammed, all Egyptians. No Saudis, Egyptians. From al-Jihad, who served in the military. Could it be that some of these people are basically intelligence officers as well? Ali Mohammed was. He informed for the CIA. He informed for the FBI. But he also was informed of bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And you, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. Zawahiri was an informant who ratted on and even gave testimony to implicate many people in the Sadat assassination. So, take that, like I said, be careful with your speculations. Some could lead to irrational ones. But it's not impossible to think that maybe some people in these groups were basically working indirectly for the intelligence services, maybe foreign, domestic, or a combination of both. Or maybe they were just radical fundamentalists who were being used by foreign or domestic agencies like Israel or Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, or the United States, or maybe even a combination of all. And all I wanted to do was I didn't want to talk about 9/11. I talked about it ad nauseum. Don't want to bore you. I did want to talk about the primary foundations of Ayman al-Zawahiri, where he got his ideology from, how much of an influence he was for bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And I hope in this video I did elucidate that to the best of my ability. And if you have any questions, I'll answer them if you want. Um, but yeah, I wanted to stop at the mid 90s basically because I didn't want to go too far. I don't like to stretch any further because I might lose you. I just wanted to condense it to a certain point in time. And I didn't even mention about um, other areas involving the Egyptian Islamic Jihad in Afghanistan and how much of an influence they had on the Arab training camps like Al Farouk, Tanak Farms, and other training camps that basically trained Al Qaeda operatives. And they were a major factor in influence in Bin Laden's life and with the ideology of Al Qaeda, and especially in the Sudan when they relocated. And I did a video about that regarding Bin Laden, Osama bin Laden, and of course Al Qaeda. I did a live video about Al Qaeda in the formula of years. Go watch that to see what I'm talking about regarding their relocation to the Sudan. And but no, I think that would be it for now. And hey, listen, thank you very much. I know a lot of you came from Reed Coverdale's Four Horsemen video, and thank you very much for coming and for entertaining me and for listening to me regarding Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri and his formula of years. And I'll see you in the next live video. Thank you very much for coming, guys.